Hello and welcome to Leadcast, our leadership series under the Soundbox Initiative. My name is Brian Tellis and I'm your host. In each episode, we sit down with a leader from the Aditya Birla Group for a conversation about the group and, of course, its businesses and to find out what the future holds for us as an organization. In today's episode, we will be speaking with Sandeep Agrawal. Now, Mr. Sandeep Agrawal holds the position of Head of Group Corporate Finance, Corporate Strategy, and Business Development at the Aditya Birla Group. Sandeep is an alumnus of IIM Lucknow and is an electronic engineer. He is also a sports and fitness enthusiast. We speak to Sandeep about the world of business with a special focus on deal making and strategy at an organizational level. We also hear from Sandeep about his mantra for getting the job done and done well. So, Sandeep, set the bar pretty high and for all the right reasons. But firstly, thank you for joining us. It's an absolute privilege to be kind of chucking questions at you, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Now, you had such a fascinating career at ABG in finance, strategy. Let's start at the beginning. I'm really intrigued to know what initially drew you to deal making and strategy. Pardon the term deal making. And how has your thinking evolved over the years?
So if I can take the liberty of going back a little bit more,
Sure.
So I did my MBA way back in 2001. I was actually very keen. I had keen sense of numbers. So I wanted to get into finance and I landed up a job with ICICI Limited, which basically was famous for corporate lending at that time, not investment banking. And as it happened, within a year of me joining, it got merged with ICICI Bank. So there was a bit of chaos, as you would expect typically as two organizations which are large merge. And I got thrown into a role which I didn't envisage when I kind of started my career. I moved to Bombay in Standard Bank, and then for 3 or 4 years I did really well in that role, which was transaction banking. But what I kept thinking about is that, while these solutions are extremely important to the company which I was serving with, but I wasn't seeing the promoters and CEOs. So, at best, you could meet CFOs. And that got me thinking as to why are promoters not keen on what I'm doing right now? And, that's where I actually thought of investment banking, creating a huge difference came about. So as soon as I got the first opportunity, which is in 2010 Stanchart, I moved to what was corporate investment banking and had a great, stint over the next 8-9 years. I also actually handled Mr. Birla as my client. I used to interact with him all the time. And there's one specific transaction I always remember. So there was JP Cement acquisition where, we sat down on the other side and Mr. Birla was there. And he went through such minute details, on the acquisition side. And that actually also got me thinking, as an advisor and, third-party investment banker, you can do as much grunt work, as much hard work as you like. But when it comes to putting in your own money, he was a prime example of how deep and detailed you can get into. So in 2019, when I got a call from Aditya Birla Group, I had spent about 16 years in Standard Chartered Bank. I met Dr. Mishra and then Mr. Birla a few times. My mind was made up, but kind of got confirmed right away. And being on the buy side, as we call it, which is where you essentially are, putting in your own money, I think it's been an extremely fascinating experience. Good 4 or 5 years in M&A, we actually did a number of transactions. Last year, actually, this year, August, September, Mr. Birla then asked me, would you like to run the strategy as well? And I couldn't actually, I loved the moment he said this, because one of the things with M&A is that you construct a deal, you create a deal, but when the deal is consummated, your involvement kind of gets over. Strategy actually allows you to essentially then run through the cycle of a company, of the transaction. And for me, just basically recommending something and then, finally closing it was not enough. To see through the fruition of, what finally happens is extremely critical for me. So I think that's something which has been very fascinating for me.
Interesting. The journey is interesting. Now, you've been, as you just said, an investment banker for many years. before you took up this role at the group, which you just kind of waxed eloquent about. I mean, talk us through the transition because you make it sound so seamless, but were there challenges? Are there challenges? And if so, how do you kind of, deal with that transition?
So I joined the group in September 2019. One of the things, and frankly, there was no surprise at all because I was handling as a client Aditya Birla Group for nearly 8 or 9 years, and the level of corporate governance, the culture was right up there, and that's something which I actually immediately saw as I came in. What, of course, was a big surprise to me is the vastness of the organization, right? I mean, you see a few companies, but when you come in, you realize how big is the machinery for everything to run perfectly, right? There are hundreds of charitable activities we run, schools, hospitals, temples, besides all the businesses we run, and it can be mind-boggling, and there is a large organization around it. So that was a bit of surprise, eventually grew on to me. Culturally, the place was extremely welcoming. One challenge I did face is that I joined September 19, the COVID happened in March 20. So the next 3 to 6 months actually went a lot of on Zoom calls. I don't like that. So at the first available opportunity, I joined office back. Mr. Bill, of course, is never a fan of working from on a remote basis as well. The other piece which actually also was very positive is that in a typical foreign bank, there is always a shareholder which is sitting somewhere, a board which is again sitting somewhere else, and the decision making, it may seem within a framework is very quick, but if you want to make an exception, it actually can be very slow. In Aditya Birla Group, surprisingly, people might think it otherwise. Decision making can be quite quick. We deliberate for quite a long time because when it's a question of putting few $100 million behind a venture or $1 billion behind a venture, you can understand you wanting to assess every single aspect of it. But I would say all in, it's actually very positive cultural change.
It is. It is. And over the last 5 years that you've been in the group, my goodness, there have been deals and acquisitions, to say the least, actually. And I have a really pertinent question. What's the secret sauce? You obviously have it. But what's that one couple of aspects or the secret sauce, as I call it, for cracking a complex deal, and taking it to fruition?
I actually live with the mantra of simplifying. So, eventually when it comes to a complex deal, people can put in like 20 things together and say that this is super complex. And I give the same advice to my daughter as well when she comes across a very complicated maths question. I said, you have to break it down to various steps, right? If you can't do that, you can't solve for it altogether. And invariably, when you break it down, there are only 3 or 4 pieces which are very complex. The rest of the stuff is actually fairly straightforward. So I think breaking down the problem into smaller pieces is extremely important. And understanding which piece is actually likely to be complex and solving that, rather than solving the whole thing together. I think that, to my mind, has been the biggest, at least for me, worked very well. I would also say that having a clear objective, a North Star in mind is extremely important, right? I mean, you can at times get lost in the process of trying to solve something without understanding what you're solving for. As long as you have that objective in mind, I think that also makes a huge amount of difference. So I would say these two.
Okay, now you mentioned, having objectives in mind, and quite rightly so. Now, in a large transaction, obviously there are 2 sides that are trying to work something out, and each of the sides have objectives. And it's pretty evident that very often you start off wanting something on both sides which may not come together, right? I mean, so there are differences of opinion, or what one calls negotiation, or negotiation in a transaction. Now, what's your style? You're allowed to be honest with us. If you use a gun, tell us. But could you share some tips for all of us who are tuned in, to this chat? What is that element that you bring to the table or you believe in?
So let me get that, the gun part out of the way right away, Brian. So usually what, if somebody brings in a point where we know that our position or the position, the counterparty is put across is totally untenable, I'm also happy to walk out or suggest that I'm walking out of the room, because you want to make sure that they understand that some things are simply non-negotiable. However, having said that, that typically negotiation would happen in once in, let's say, 20 conversations, or once in 10 or 15 conversation. But the counterparty should know that you are willing to walk out if there are, conditions which are put, which you absolutely cannot. And not only that, they should be scared to also put up those conditions at some level. That's one. But most importantly for me is to establish an extremely well connect with the counterparty. Eventually, you cannot come with an objective of thinking that the other party is working against your interest. They have to go back with the feeling that they also won in the process as you've won. And that requires, when you get into a negotiation, an extremely high level of preparedness. You get into a conversation, they have a very good understanding, they put something across, and if you cannot counter it with rational argument, you say that I want this, but you don't have an argument to support it, or not a rational enough argument, and that rational argument will have 2 or 3 faces, because they would have heard the first part of the argument, would have thought about it, but you need to have second and third layers as well. I think then people tend to drop their defenses. So and the other thing is that you can't get into again a negotiation thinking that you will absolutely take away everything. I always say that you have to be willing to lose smaller battles to win the war. There are few points which, if you can give away to actually retain your larger objective, you have to be willing to do that as well. Because if you go across and the other party thinks that you're absolutely inflexible, then you are likely to lose on larger points, and you absolutely don't want to lose larger points at all. So,
that's a very pertinent point you raised, about you got to give some to get some, or get some more. Also, strategists, often need to think several moves ahead. You mentioned preparedness.
Yes.
When, you need to be ahead of the curve, simply put. Now, how do you balance focusing on long-term goals or objectivity while managing the demands, let's say, of each meeting or day-to-day decision making?
One, first and foremost for me is to have a really best-in-class team. And the reason I say is that in M&A typically, the execution can be extremely intense. You must have heard that investment bankers are working late nights. That's because when it comes to deal negotiation, structuring, documentation, all of that takes a lot of time. If you intend to be present in every single conversation, drive every single conversation, I don't think one can actually look at the long-term vision at all. So if you have very capable team who you trust, and you know that they will bring about only relevant issues to you, and that process is repeated over a time, that they understand your mind, you understand their mind, I think that solves about 80% of the problem. You are still going to be, looking at 20% of the problem. Second thing I do is not to fill up my calendar all 5 days a week to the fullest. That demand happens all the time, but you have to leave few afternoons which you have enough space in the calendar, and that may allow you to read, allow you to just basically sit quietly, kind of think what's happening out there. Sometimes if I can't get any thoughts, I start to note down a few things just to put it down, and it invariably triggers. So for me, to be moving away from total busyness to then have obviously a team which is able to execute itself, to have a calendar which allows me time to think, and then obviously keeping the overall objective of the group in mind, I think has helped me a lot. The other thing which I also do is to also continuously look at the environment as to where the problems are and where the value creation is actually happening, and how we can anticipate that as we go along. And I remember this in the bank also, when we used to execute the transactions or did something, product manuals didn't allow it. I would of course secure the approvals to allow that transition to happen, but I would also go back and try and get the product manuals changed, which basically would allow me the future transactions to happen without needing to go again and again for the same thing.
Okay. Strategic thinking, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is often compared to a game that one plays. And I'm going to use the example of golf, for instance, where, it's precision that counts. Every decision counts. and for every decision to be made right. You just waxed eloquent earlier about what it takes. Now, how has your passion, and I have done my homework, how has your passion for golf, influenced the way you approach decision making, long term planning, and the likes?
So, there is a saying in golf, what has happened in the past is in your head. What happens in future is in your hands, which basically is that, what you can do is with your clubs. What has happened, you can't do anything about by and large of it. There are decisions which you've taken collectively, individually, which may not turn out to be as possibly expected in terms of what happens in the short term. You can't do anything about those any longer. You can't reverse those decisions. But what you can do with what you have right now is far more critical. The second piece, again in golf, as they call it, is every stroke counts. So you can't. It's not something which you could play one bad stroke, and there are enough championships which have been lost on from few millimeters perspective. So you have to go back with the same focus every single time. Again, goes back to decision making. What has happened is fine, but when you are on the ball, you effectively focus on as if it's a completely new, fresh situation. You look at it completely objectively. So that's something which is extremely critical. Third is typically, even Tiger Woods will you must have heard about. He's undergone swing changes probably 30 times, maybe 20 times over his career. He's learning all the time. I have played nearly about 10 sports at variety level of competitiveness. Golf has been by far the most difficult sports to learn, to master, because there are 14 clubs. Each club has a slightly different role. Every course, every shot is different. And I think that's applicable to life also. You have to continuously learn. Today, people complain about AI. Golf is actually a good form of AI. You're continuously learning, absorbing all the time, every bit of information which comes in you.
You make life sound so easy and interesting, which I'm glad it is in your mind. But in both leadership and golf, no matter how well you plan, obviously there's always, the unexpected. Like they say, there's no success without failure. And failure can do two things to you. It can either consume you, or you could use it as a learning curve and never make those mistakes again. Now, that having been said, I'm sure you've had moments, in your career where something didn't go as well as you expected it to go. And when that happens, how do you handle those moments? How do you handle, those happenings?
So there are, of course, it's you're absolutely right, Brian. There are quite a few moments. Thankfully, no huge setbacks, but there are few setbacks which definitely So, there's basically way back in 2017 or 18, it was when my boss moved out then, who was head of corporate banking, Stanchart Bank. I felt that I might or should get that role. I did. They basically got in somebody from outside of Stanchart Bank India network, pretty senior, because they felt that a lot of people who are my peers may not be comfortable reporting into me. So in some ways, I felt that that's something which I expected should have happened. But the next 2 years turned out to be my best years, in terms of how the performance went by, because I was sailing. I mean, it was like kayaking downstream. I knew everything about the roles which I was doing then. The new boss who had come in was actually phenomenally good himself as well, very cooperative. He actually wanted me to be absolutely ready to be able to take over from him in a year and a half's time. And as it happened, during that period is when actually I got a call from Aditya Birla Group. So I don't think even this Aditya Birla Group thing would have happened if I had actually gone and done that, role. 6 months later, of course, after joining the group, the call did come from the, the bank, but of course by that time, and I'm very happy for the decision I made. So and that's true in a lot of situations when actually a setback has happened. Another door typically ends up getting open. And it wasn't even a big setback, if you like. And that has been my philosophy. In sports, in golf, you lose so many matches that if you actually start sulking after every loss, you probably stay home and not go anywhere else. And that keeps me totally grounded in terms of knowing that no matter how well you prepared, no matter what you do before, after, there is still a possibility of potential failure. You can only work harder, practice harder to make sure that those instances are minimized. But beyond that, you just have to accept it as it comes at times.
Sure. I love the analogies you draw, from the world of sports, obviously being the sportsman you are. And it's so intrinsically linked with the professional side of life, be it corporate side of life, whichever way you look at it. But leaders often find, as you just said, inspiration, and inspiration sometimes from unexpected quarters, right? Now, I won't talk about sport, I'll talk about people. Uh, I'm very interested in knowing uh, what or who has been a significant source of inspiration for you, whether it's in your career or on the course. You did speak of Tiger Woods a little earlier, but I'm very keen to know, on behalf of our listeners, as also personally, who or what have been your inspirations or driving forces?
In the last 5 years and maybe last 8, 9 years, having interacted very closely with Mr. Birla himself, he's been, I think, anybody he's met and interacted regularly, he's been a source of inspiration. And I'll give you 3 or 4 examples. So, there's this Supreme Court judgment which came against us in Asia judgment on Vodafone Idea. I remember speaking to him on the same night, and you couldn't actually see any difference in his voice whatsoever, no agitation, nothing. And I was thinking, how is that even practically possible? And I mean, I definitely couldn't sleep for a couple of nights, because it was the biggest levy ever levied on any company. And I felt that was absolutely astounding. His humility, no matter when he meets you or who he meets, is incredible. I mean, that's something I've learned a lot from. The patience he can show, of course, impatient as well, but patience he can show in a lot of situations. Again, it's absolutely amazing. Among other people, there's a very close friend of mine who strive for excellence, has been actually extremely inspiring. He also happens to play golf, runs a private equity firm, and does a lot of other stuff. But again, something which I've seen him very closely. And then variety of other people have been source of inspirations. My various bosses, number of colleagues, my wife, even my daughter, actually, the level of sincerity both of them bring, it's absolutely amazing. So actually, personally, and that has continued till today. And I was actually telling you, Brian, even looking at you on stage, and I used to be a very nervous speaker when it came onto stage, and I looked at you and I said that I need to be
If
a little
that
bit.
loser can speak on stage, so can I.
No, but it's so I think it's at varying degree of levels. There are a lot of places where you can find inspirations from, and actually I do that all the time, to be honest with you. I don't think there's only one source of inspiration one picks up from. And if you observe people closely, it's your subordinates, colleagues. There's a subordinate of mine who actually has been hospitalized 3 or 4 times, but every time he comes back from hospital, if you look at him working, you wouldn't think that he's actually been to hospital with the same dedication. That is, to me, a huge inspiration as well. So
Yeah, but on a lighter note, to end our really lovely conversation, something that comes to mind which is unexpected or even quirky that you turn to for inspiration or to recharge. What's that you do?
if I have a very agitated mind, or even when I'm feeling slightly down on energy, the thing which I find the best release of energy for me is like a absolutely intense workout session.
Is that
So
right?
yeah, so it's like if I go out for good an hour and a half, burnt every single calorie, and till the time I need glucose. I think that's been and it sometimes releases endorphins. You feel that there is something in life which is working very well. You have a lot of energy left. So actually places my mind in a different zone. I mean, it's a little bit meditative as well for me. You get your breathing back to normal. So I think for me, exercise, when I have really had difficult week or otherwise, I anyways exercise very regularly. But I actually increase my intensity a notch or two when I'm a little bit of under. It's
I'm
just
going to take cue, from you on that one because it really is an interesting point you make. Most people would think of relaxing
yeah,
and stuff, but I've met people who end up and became victims of overthinking.
yeah,
But when you're exercising and you're really pushing yourself hard, it takes you away from
yeah,
conventional thinking and gives you that, almost fresh lease of balance and, of neutrality, so to speak, in areas of concern. But Sandeep, I don't know how to say this. What a tremendous conversation. And I'm sure if we had the luxury of more time, we could have, dived way deeper into all the stuff we've been chatting about. Who knows? Maybe we will have an opportunity to kind of trouble you a little bit more for our personal and the listeners' benefit. But I just got to say a huge, huge thank you to you for joining us. The man himself, what can I say? Sandeep Agrawal. We've reached the end of today's Leadcast conversation with ABG's podcast initiative. And it's been a privilege. You've heard of Soundbox. If you haven't, this is exactly it. We hope you've enjoyed listening to this conversation. And if you have any feedback, importantly for us, just drop in your comments below. I mean, we will be back soon enough, that's a promise, with another episode, another fascinating conversation. This one's going to be a tough one to raise the bar on, but we'll see you soon. Thank you very much for joining us.